Okay, well, welcome everybody to this webinar tonight with Helen Beynon. This is sort of sponsored by the Stop the Wensum Link campaign here in Norfolk, which we'll say a bit about later. I just want to get straight on and introduce Helen. Helen Benjamin is a writer, ecologist and author who's been campaigning against roads for 30 years. And presentation tonight actually goes back to the early 90s, I think, and the beginning of that 30-year period. And Helen's going to tell us about the Twyford Down protests in the early 90s and her book, Twyford Rising. So hand over to you, Helen.
Right, I think there may be a couple of people in the waiting room. You might just want to check. But yes, if you want to put the slides up, Andrew, then we'll make a start. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. Just nice to be sure of that. Thank you. So yes, about 5 years ago, I realised that I was going to various events and people were talking about the Twyford Down protests, which was the first of the big sort of direct action protests of the 90s, the sort of first environmental direct action protest of this scale. And it was against road building through Twyford Down, which was a chalk hill in Hampshire. And I realised I was going to these events and people were talking about it, but nobody'd ever actually written the history down. And I thought to myself, things get lost in translation. And so it was time to start writing it down, really. And I decided to do it by stitching together interviews and stories with people who'd taken part. And really that was because there was so many different voices and so many different perspectives and so many different ideas that really informed that campaign. So it seemed necessary to do it in that way. It's too much of a story for one person to tell, really. But it was also very important to me that this book has a life, that it isn't just a piece of history, that it is actually used to talk about the lessons learned and to help inspire other campaigns. So, you know, it's really great to be here with the campaign against the Western Link Road around Norwich, because that to me gives it some meaning. So I'm very grateful to be here with that. I think I've noticed looking down the list, there's many people here who I know are writers and artists of different descriptions. And I think that most of you will agree that often the hardest bit is the beginning. The hardest bit is knowing where to start. And sometimes you write other bits first and then you come back and write the beginning. And that was certainly what happened to me. Was I started kind of putting together all the different voices and didn't really know where I was starting. And it became clear as I was going along that really this was the story of the place, and the place Twyford Down was very central to the story. And I just want to read a little bit from the beginning because I think it helps to sort of clarify that. At the bottom of you can see in the picture where the hill was removed to make the road. That was actually once one hill right across there. And in the foreground where the people are standing, there was actually a chalk river, just like there is at the Wensum, the Itchen River, which runs through Hampshire, which is a very beautiful chalk stream. And beyond it, to the north of it, is still a dry valley, doesn't have a river in it, called Plague Pits Valley. And so this is just a brief description of the landscape that gives you a quick idea. So it begins by talking about Plague Pits Valley. This dry, steep-sided valley is dotted with gnarled thorn bushes and named for the Winchester plague dead, supposedly buried in mass graves beneath. The broad valley floor grows tall in summer, studded with flowers of knapweed, dropwort, and salad burnet. Above and to the north of the valley are the Iron Age ramparts that ring St. Catherine's Hill, with a knot of beech trees at the summit and the faint outline of a 12th century chapel. To the south, another steep slope has an almost circular copse, known as Arethusa's Clump, growing on the site of a dew pond that was once created for watering livestock high up on the dry chalk hill. This southern slope, with thin turf over chalk, has summer flowers of thyme, horseshoe vetch, cowslip and rock rose. The slope and a bridleway through the woods at the eastern end of Plague Pits Valley once led sharply up and on to Twyford Down. And I think really what emerged when I was writing, and what I remember of the place, and I remember the first time I walked there, was that this is a really, really remarkable place. It was a very, very beautiful place. It was a very wild place, and it had been open to the public for walking on for hundreds of years, so it was very widely used. And Keats wrote about it. Keats visited when he was very ill with his first bout of TB, and he wrote about how the air was worth sixpence a pint up on the down, which gives you a feeling of how lovely it was. William Cobbett also rode across it. So in the 1820s, William Cobbett wrote this journal about riding through southern England and about the agriculture and the farming that he saw. And he praised the downland for being high, dry land that was good for sheep. And as well as the sort of the richness of the wildlife and the beauty of the landscape, there were also a number of scheduled ancient monuments along the route of the road. So there was a couple of Bronze Age burial mounds. There was the remains of an Iron Age village up there, and there was also a series of trackways. And I don't know if I can move the slides on, but I think Nick might be able. Sorry, Andrew might be able to. Somebody called Nick in the waiting room confusing me. So Andrew, if you can move us on to the next slide. So this is the top of the down as it was before the road was built. And the sort of ripples you can see there in the land were medieval trackways that had sort of vegetated over with this sort of wonderful flower-rich chalk grassland. If you go on to the next one, Andrew, we can see it a bit more clearly. So yeah, that was what the landscape looked like, this kind of strange rippling landscape. And I think it's true to say that it was a very remarkable place, and that drew together very remarkable people. And I think that's often the case, that these things happen because some very remarkable people get involved. And before my book starts, and before the direct action started, there'd been a local campaign against the road for 20 years that had gone through 3 public inquiries and at least 1 judicial review. And there was a very, very long campaign against the road. And I think it's worth saying that, because I think with the Western Link Road, there's a bit of a public perception that the deal is done, and it's really only just started. And so, you know, this gives you a real idea of how long these things can run for. And one of the people who was involved in this campaign was a guy called Chris Gillam, who helped me write the book by piecing together a lot of the background information for me. And I've got a little quote here from Chris, and much of what I will read is actually other people's quotes today, because I think they speak for so much. So this is what Chris says about the long campaign that the locals had against the road. Everyone who has fought a major road scheme will know what it is about. They will know of the corruption of process. They will have heard the politicians of all parties equivocate. They will have been talked down by those horrid priestcraft, the traffic engineers, cramped minds with a perverse vocabulary, designed to mystify and conceal the emptiness in their thinking. They will have met the journalists and the media men that feign sympathy and compile their balanced reports, as if there were a halfway point between right and wrong. They will have endured the landscape architects, the noise consultants, the environmental assessors, the agency men and quangocrats who sell the bottle or sell or bottle out. And everyone is dimly aware of the local authority officials who seem to be working to some agenda that has nothing to do with the policy of those the people have elected. So I'm sure that a lot of you will recognise exactly what Chris is talking about if you've been involved in anything like this ever before. So there was this long campaign against the road that went through these public inquiries and through the planning process, and eventually they came to naught. And in January 1992, the initial contract was left to demolish some of the aspects of along the roads. There were some old railway bridges that needed demolishing. there was a section of canal that needed to be filled in, and the Itchen River itself was to be put into a sort of concrete canal for a section. And that was the point at which some of the locals decided that they weren't prepared to give up, that they felt there was still a campaign to be had and there were still things that could be done. And this had never happened before. I think it's so important to say, you know, this is the point at which history changes, because nobody had ever taken this on. And one of those involved in the local campaign was a Conservative Party councillor called David Croker. And if the environmental movement has heroes, and David Croker is one of mine. He sat on the local sort of police board, and, you know, as I said, he was a Conservative Party councillor. And he heard about a very embryonic group in the UK of people calling themselves Earth First, which is an idea that had come from America. It's not really an organisation, it's just a banner that people gather under to do direct action on environmental issues. And David heard about this group. He got on the train, he went to London, he found a squat in the back streets of Brixton where they were meeting. And he went to this meeting in this sort of, I've been to this squat, place called Coultan. He went in this very sort of dingy building, sat down with these kind of 20-something environmental activists and said, we need you to come down, and we need things to happen. And that was where it all began. A group of people went down from London, and they got involved in demolishing the railway bridges. And there's actually a quote in the book from somebody who was in that meeting. So it's, you know, it's quite an incredible part of the story, really, that so much hinges on that happening. At the same time, a couple who'd been traveling, they'd been living in the car, and then the car broke down and they were just living in a tent, and they'd been walking the ancient trackways of Britain. They'd been walking the Ridgeway. They were both artists and musicians, and living a very sort of hand-to-mouth existence by busking. And quite by chance, they were in the area. They went on a guided walk that somebody from the campaign was running, and they hit upon the idea of just living on the down. And again, nobody'd had a protest camp of this nature. There'd been things like the camp at Greenham Common, but nobody'd ever sort of gone and lived on that land that they were defending in the same way. And so this couple, Sam and Steph, moved on to the land. And one of my favorite quotes in the whole book is from Sam, because she really had this idea of living very close to the land. And one of the things she said was, you know, in those days, if I wanted a fork, I just cut a twig and I made myself a fork. You know, it was a very, very simple way of living. And Sam and Steph were to have a very big influence on the whole protest culture that evolved afterwards, after Twyford Down. And this idea of living close to the land and defending close to the land was something that they were very instrumental in. So by the time we get to the sort of spring of 1992, we've got these three very sort of definite strands to the campaign. There's the locals who are still carrying on, and they're still doing a lot of legal campaigning. They tried to take the campaign to Europe. They ran a campaign through Parliament that in the run up to the 1992 election. You've got the Earth First group, which is sort of a bit like a snowball. It's kind of rolling along, and it's gathering people as people sort of come on board with this idea of direct action against environmental destruction. And you've got this, again, you've got another growing group of people who hear about people living on the land and decide to go and join them. I have to say, it wasn't always an easy alliance. Not everybody got on all the time, you know. I think it's important to recognise that it's not always straightforward. But, you know, they did learn to cooperate and work together and create a campaign. A lot of the campaign, and quite as big of the book, is about the living on the land and how important that was to people. And I just want to read a couple of quotes that underline that. And they talk about living in benders, and benders are a type of tent that was inherited slightly from gypsies, because if you have a family of gypsies living in a horse-drawn wagon, you can't all sleep in the wagons. So they would make shelters out of hazel rods bent over, coppiced hazel bent over, and a tarpaulin put on top. But the same structures were used by the Peace Women at Greenham Common, and a few Peace Women from Greenham Common had come down and really given the benefit of their experience to the younger folk at Twyford Down, and that was very valued. They were incredible. The Greenham women were so incredibly focused, but also incredibly knowledgeable on the law, which was very useful as people started getting arrested. So you need to understand what a bender is to understand this quote. And this quote is from Selina, who started living on the Down in the summer, and Selina's a musician. I hadn't realised that you could do it in our climate. It felt like real freedom to live in such simple structures as benders. Although there were times of being very cold or wet, it didn't seem to matter in comparison to the warmth and joy of sharing a space with lovely people, telling stories or sat by the fireside, making music in a circle, creating our own entertainment, sharing tales of our lives, or making things together in preparation for an action. The harmony and simplicity of it seemed to fill an aching gap in my life. And this is a quote from Ingrid, who was another woman who lived on the Down. It didn't matter who you were, as long as you related to the cause. This was, we belonged to the land. Our ancestors were free at one time to eke out a living from the land, from hedgerows and streams. Our heritage is in the land around us. We were there to wake the dragon, our ancestral memory of what it was to live in a connected way around the fire. We weren't about to let the Department of Transport take that away, or the downland we were bonded with. And that very deep connection to the land was, I think it was very particular to Twyford Down. I think later campaigns have not had such a deep connection to a place. And one of the guys who was involved laughed. He said to me afterwards, he said, for some of us, this wasn't just about road building. You know, any development in that place would have been wrong. It wasn't just about the road. It was about protecting that piece of land. But for some people, it was very much about roads and transport. And I think it does teach me that it's important to bring people together from all aspects, whatever their views are, really, to find that common ground. So I think we can move on a slide, Andrew. Yeah, so that's a very roughly made bender, and people having breakfast around the fire. And is there another one? So this is two women, Sam and Heather. Sam's on the left with the scarf around her neck. Oh, where are we? Yeah. Face painting for actions, and face paint was often used for people to sort of disguise their identity when they were on actions, and the actions really just involved going down to the construction site where demolition and the beginning of construction work was happening. And at that time there were no real laws to stop people doing it. I think there are some very fundamental differences between now and then. One of them is certainly that the laws have changed, and it's not so easy legally to do this kind of stuff now. But the other thing is there was no social media, and I spend quite a bit of the book exploring that as a theme, that it ran in several ways. It made it very difficult to actually publicize what was happening. It meant that if you wanted to publicize it, you very often had to go to events with leaflets and just hand them out in a very old, which sounds so old-fashioned now, doesn't it? We had an old-fashioned thing called a phone tree, where everybody had a number and you just passed information on from one phone number to another, because there was no Facebook, there was no text messaging, there was no Twitter. It was all done like that. But I think the other thing it underlines is how isolated the people living on the Down were. It was a sort of half a mile walk to the nearest point for food and water, and the sense of isolation is something a lot of people explore in the book. That living high up on the Down for the best part of a year was, quite an isolating experience. Anyway, we can move on a slide, I think. So people lived on the Down through, I think somebody in the meeting, I think Rafe, that's a picture of you in the background standing there, if I'm right. So people lived on the Down through to the beginning of December. And at the beginning of December, police machinery and security guards came on to move the camp off the downland. This was an eviction of sorts, but it was also because what people were doing was protecting the downland from the stripping of turf. And this was supposed to be an environmental exercise to remove the chalk turf with all its wildflowers in and move it somewhere else in the hope that it would actually take somewhere else. And so this was supposed to be an environmental exercise. And I think it's Ingrid in the book sort of says, you know, everyone had assumed that what would happen was a few guys with spades would turn up and sort of carefully peel the turf off. What actually happened was they came on with large machinery, and they only took some of the turf, and most of it was just driven over and reduced to mud. And because they anticipated problems with the protesters being there, they used a large amount of security guards, and they turned up at dawn with about 100 security guards surrounding the machinery. And this was completely unprecedented. This had never happened. You know, we've all been, well, a lot of us have been following the HS2 evictions, and we sort of know what to expect, but then we really didn't. And David Bellamy happened to be present for some of the day, and David Bellamy wrote his PhD on the flora of Twyford Down, and he happened to be visiting on this day, and he said at the time of violence he'd seen against environmental campaigners anywhere in the world, because the level of violence was incredible. And you can see here, you can flick through the next couple of photos actually, Andrew. So what they did at the end of the day, you can see the machinery here being brought to strip the turf, and to stop people coming in, they used, stop on the, they put this razor wire, barbed wire, and then they replaced it with razor wire, like a military compound around the top of the down. And people were just lying in it, trying to stop it and trying to do everything they could to actually stop the machinery. And somewhere I'll find it, I've got a quote from somebody. So this is from a woman called Becca, who anyone who's involved with the Transport Action Network will know Becca well. And she was there on the day, she was living on the down. And she says, on the horizon, waves of machinery appeared, rolling over the down towards the dongas. The yellow jackets formed circles around the machines, allowing the machines to progress towards the ditches, barricades, and to the waiting dongas tribe. This was a well-planned assault. Protesters were dragged by whatever the guards could lay their hands on, hair, wrists, ankles, through the bulldozed hawthorn bushes. Protesters were driven at and over. Female protesters were sexually assaulted and had their clothes ripped off. Male protesters were booted in the kidneys, taken behind machinery and beaten by ex-army trained guards. This is what they termed minimal reasonable force. And we just want to move on to a next slide, I think. So yeah, that's another one. And I think there's one more in this sequence. Yeah, so that was pretty much what it looked like at the end of the day. And this went on for 2 days. And at the end of it, everyone just sort of left, really. But what was remarkable was that a few weeks later, they all came back. And again, a bit like the point of the meeting in the squat with the Tory councillor, I feel this point was a real turning point, because people didn't give up. They didn't say, this is at the end, that they actually came back. And we can move on to the next slide, actually, Andrew. And the direct action continued. You can see this is from early 1993. This is about spring 93. And there started to be a whole series of blockading bulldozers and a number of sort of big set piece actions to try and draw attention to what was happening. So if you move on to the next one. There we go. So this was a campaign trying to draw together different campaigns. The one with the people lined up, the next one, Andrew. Yeah, that one shows how much wider the cutting actually was than had been put into the planning permission. And I think it's worth saying that, you know, the visual impact of a road is incredible, but often the plans are way out and things will be much bigger and much more visually intrusive than they actually appear on paper in the first place. I'm just gonna have a drink. So yeah, the width of the people there is the width that it should have been, and as you can see, it's substantially wider. As well as actually this being incredible because people just kept going, what happened at this time is that there was an increasing amount of links to other road campaigns and the beginnings of a movement nationally against the government's road building programme. And I think anyone who's involved in the Western Link campaign will recognise that there's a big parallel to now when we have another big national road building programme. And I think it's worth saying that at this point, we started to realise that this wasn't just about one road through one hill. And we actually used to use that phrase. We used to say, this isn't about one road through one hill. This is going to be something bigger. This is going to be every road that comes forward. And another phrase we used to use was getting in early. You know, really at Twyford Down, we left it a bit too late. You know, we waited till the machinery were coming onto site. But really, it's those early stages of the campaign where you can win. But that said, I do think that by doing this, we raised awareness and we made it so difficult and we made it so much more expensive. People like Chris Gillam and David Croker, who'd been involved for a long time, one of the things they'd said from early on is, why not put the road in a tunnel? Why put it through the hill? And in the end, the additional costs that we caused them meant that actually it would have been just as cost effective to have put it in a tunnel. And I think that's a big lesson. Another phrase we used to talk about was that we felt we had what we used to call noisy defeats and quiet victories. So Twyford Down was a noisy defeat. It brought in a lot of people, it got a lot of media, it made a lot of noise, but it was a defeat. But behind the scenes, there was supposed to be a road through a nature reserve at Hindhead and through another piece of chalk downland. And that got put in a tunnel because of what happened at Twyford Down. The East London River crossing, which would have taken out one of the last ancient woods in London, Oxley's Wood, was scrapped as a road scheme. And I think those, you know, those noisy defeats and quiet victories are very important things to bear in mind. So through all of this, the campaign, as I said, it kept going. You can move on a slide, I think, Andrew. Yeah, so there was another camp set up off the route where people could use as a base for actions. And yeah, the one on the bridge, pause on the one on the bridge. So yeah, this was a big day-long action to blockade the building of a Bailey bridge, a temporary army bridge, which was used for bringing in machinery to do work. And yeah, you can go on to the next one. This shows the work in progress. So this is sort of the summer of 1993, and you can see the down being moved away there. Yeah, you can go on to the next one. This is an action against Tarmac, who were the construction engineers building the road. Their offices were occupied for a day. And yeah, go on to the next one, Andrew. Yeah, so there you can see more of the down being taken away. And we'll just stop there a minute. So as a consequence of all of these actions, 6 people were sent to prison. It was initially 7 and then it went to 6. And they spent 2 weeks in prison for taking part in the actions at Twyford Down, for breaking a High Court injunction banning them from doing so. And they deliberately defied the injunction. And one of the things I've included in the book is a statement from a woman called Emma, who was one of those who went to prison for 2 weeks. And Emma says, "I grew up a few miles from Twyford Down and walked over its beautiful rolling slopes on many occasions. Now Twyford Down is a gaping chasm, and the Itchen Valley at its foot has an enormous embankment stretching across it. By this process of turning valleys into hills and hills into valleys, the Department of Transport is levelling out our nation's heritage and history. I cannot consent to the willful annihilation of such an immense swathe of our heritage by an ephemeral government. To have ceased protesting in the face of this desecration would have meant giving that consent." And I just think that's such an incredibly inspiring speech, that for a woman in her 20s to have given knowing full well that she would be taken out of that dock and go to prison for 2 weeks. I think that was quite a brave and incredible thing to have done, really. I'm going to really leave much of it there, because I think the rest of it we can talk about through questions. I do want to draw attention to the fact that we are now facing a road programme of a similar magnitude again. And the great thing is that, as Andrew and others will know, the schemes around the country are starting to work together again, just as we did back then, because it's so important to do that. And I also feel it is quite important that what happened at Twyford Down has its place in the history books. It is a story that wasn't really told until I wrote this book, and I think it's so important to tell that story, because it's the story of how people came to work together to make a difference, and people from so many different backgrounds. But I also think that the current road building programme also needs to be consigned to history, quite frankly. It's an out-of-date way of looking at our transport system. It's not where we need to be going in the future as we change our lives, and it's very important to remain that. And on that point, I want to finish with a quote from a friend of mine, Ollie. And Ollie was a student in Manchester who got involved with the Earth First network and started coming to protests at Twyford Down. And when I interviewed Ollie for the book, he said something that I felt I had to include, even though it was a bit of a reality jolt to me as a writer of the story. And this is Ollie's quote: "I think it's important to keep pointing out that the best way to understand it all is to go and do it yourself. That being part of the resistance is more meaningful than reading, and we resisted." So I'm happy to just chat informally. And oh, do you want to go through the rest of the slides, Andrew? I forgot those a bit. So that's the sort of finished road almost. What's next? Yeah, and this is a family photograph. I'll tell you. I did the graffiti and my brother took the photograph. So there's a nice little family affair there, and that's the cutting over Twyford Down, pretty much as it is today, really. Although that was taken a few years ago now. So I'm happy to drop the slides and we can have more of a sort of informal chat.
Thank you very much, Helen. Can't see any questions yet in the chat, so I'll start off with a very practical one, if I could. How can we buy your book? Are you able to put a link in or somewhere?
Oh yes, I'll put that in the chat for you. Yeah, I'll
Right.
do that now.
Highly recommended.
Thank you.
I saw Richard Hawker had his hand up, so I'm just going to ask you to unmute, Richard. Well, we'll wait for Richard to unmute. Just say, yeah, do put your hand up, but I can't see everybody. So if I don't see you, put a question in the chat, please. Fire away, Richard.
Well, I was just going to say, it's actually not so much about the road building, but something similar must have gone on in the 1850s and 1860s regarding the railways, because they were built over maybe 20 or 30 years over the whole of the country. And it's just a comment that it's just terrible that it's happened again with roads. Yeah. We had the railways. We had all that destruction, all that construction of the railways throughout the whole country, and we destroyed them. And we started doing it again with motorways. It's unbelievable. But that doesn't help to say that. I'm just.
One of the things I talk about at the beginning, where I write about the landscape around Twyford Down, is that there was actually a canal that was built, and then the railway was put next to the canal, and then the old road, the one that was actually replaced by the cutting through Twyford Down, was put next to the railway. And that along this river valley, you had three generations of different sorts of transport, and it still wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so pointed that, you know, it wasn't enough.
That's happened in the middle of Birmingham.
Yeah.
My hometown. You have the old canal, the Faisley Canal, I think it was, and then the railway next to it, and then the M6 or the Aston Expressway. It's unbelievable. We just do the same thing time and time again. You know, why not just stick with the original one? But I just, as I put in my chat, you know, I take my hat off to you, the brave people who tried to stop this Twyford. I didn't have the courage to do that myself.
Well, I mean, I'd never done anything like that, Richard. And my personal story was I'd actually been overseas, and I came back and I was penniless, and I stayed with my mum for a few weeks, and she told me something about some of these sort of initial protests. She'd seen them on the local television, and then I got a job nearby. I just happened to get a job in the sort of next town to Twyford Down. Had I got a job in Edinburgh, I probably wouldn't have gone. I mean, it was such a sort of chance. And I saw a poster for a demonstration, and I thought, oh, I'll go and see what that's about, because I heard Mum mention it. And I went up there, and it was a morning, it was the 1st of May. And I mean, I trained as a botanist, and I just couldn't take my eyes off the chalk flora. I mean, you know, talk about love at first sight. And I remember it was so incredible, that chalk downland. I took my boots off because I thought, I can't walk on this in my boots. It's got too much life in it. And there were various speeches going on, and I paid them absolutely no attention whatsoever, because I was just down on my hands and knees looking at what was alive in this grassland. And once you've made that connection with somewhere, once you've seen that, I don't think bravery comes into it. You know, I think you just have to do whatever you can. So there's a thing about, I noticed in the chat, Jill has said that violence is less once people can film it on their phones. Yeah, I think that isolation, as I said, you know, that isolation was a big thing. Isolated both physically from people and in terms of communication. There's a very funny story in the book about somebody trying to give us a mobile phone, and us all trying to decide how to work a very early mobile phone, which is very funny. There's also a thing about Mackenzie Friend. I think Mackenzie Friend originated with the Peace Women. But it got handed down to us. And a Mackenzie Friend is, if you're in court and you haven't got a solicitor, you can ask somebody to give you legal advice in court, and that is recognised by the court. What's the other one?
There's one above from Jan Davis. Jan, I think you've unmuted, so perhaps you could just ask yours.
Yeah, thanks, Helen, as well. No, I was just wondering, I mean, the other night we had a presentation on the Wensum Valley, and looking at environmental protections, legal aspects that we could explore. And I'm just wondering to what extent that was the case with Twyford Down. And maybe, you know, if there is anything that we can learn from that. And, you know, because actually today's been quite successful in terms of legal campaigns that have been running, which is great to see. And it feels like there's a bit of a momentum there to actually use the policies and environmental protections that are in place against these awful schemes.
Well, one of the things that is, I haven't gone into it because it is quite complicated, but there was a big backstory with what happened at Twyford Down, and it was essentially that John Major, when he was Prime Minister, had a spat with Europe, and it came down to arguing over trade deals and environmental protection. And basically, what happened was that the European Parliament agreed to let the British government go ahead with building some very environmentally damaging road schemes, even though they contravened all of the habitats and species regulations. And they did this sort of mealy-mouthed way of doing it, in that what they said was, well, those schemes had already been planned, so we'll let them go ahead. And actually, none of the environmental assessments had ever been done, and an environmental assessment was never done on Twyford Down, which is unbelievable, because there were 2 SSSIs and 3 scheduled ancient monuments and a nature reserve, and it's part of what's now a national park, and was then an area of outstanding natural beauty. And so what we were left with was, I think there were about 7 schemes that were part of this deal to do with the Maastricht Treaty. And some of us are old enough to remember the Maastricht Treaty. And those were the ones that we really highlighted through the roads protest. So, and one of the things I talk about in the book was that most media representations tend to sound like it was all very random, and that we were a bunch of hippies who just turned up somewhere because there was going to be a bulldozer there. But actually, we'd sat down and we worked out that there were these very damaging schemes that had been agreed because they were considered to be in the pipeline. And so to some respect, the legislation was there, but it was being ignored for these schemes. And that legislation is pretty much what we still have. There's a bit of strengthening since, and things like special protection areas and special areas of conservation have come in since then. But essentially, it is what came in through the habitat regs in '91 that are really important for the protection. The difference now is, from what we had, is that with a bit of luck, they should be acted upon, and there should be a legal duty to act upon them. Whereas what we had was this terrible situation where the government decided they were not relevant. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I mean, it's very useful, that history, and useful to know that yes, they were able to get away with it because of the deals that they managed to negotiate.
And you know, one of the people who's mentioned several times in the book was the EU Transport Minister, Carlos Ripa-Dimignana, who was very against the Twyford Road and tried to make the European Union block it. And he was actually deposed from his job on the instigation of John Major. And Carlos Ripa-Dimignana actually went and visited the women who were in prison. He was that supportive afterwards. So,
well, it's perhaps trying to understand what those deals are, yeah, especially at a local level, because clearly there are you know, machinations at a local level which allows these things to go ahead, and it's somehow trying to undermine those. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So have we got any others there?
Yeah, I mean, can I just come in on that, on the legal thing? We have got 3 other questions. That what came out the other night is that, I mean, it's very interesting to hear how the law's been strengthened, but of course there's now this thing where they can sort of override the habitats if there's some sort of overriding public reason, and that's what the council are going to try to do probably. And of course also people like Natural England and the Environment Agency sort of undermine the strength of the habitats regulations as well. So that's what we're up against now. I think I've got questions from Jen, Jamie and Rachel. To take them in that order. Jenny, do you want to ask yours live? Not hearing from Jen, so I'll just read it out. It's quite a quick one. At what stage did activists accept that the campaign was lost and no point carrying on? That's from Jen Parkhouse.
Yeah, so that is something I touch on in the book, and the real problem was that we had this High Court injunction taken out against us, which meant that for taking any kind of protest or even being seen to support protest on the site would lead to a 2-week jail sentence, and that was really what put an end to it. And I think once the tarmac went down as well, it was pretty obvious that the road was going to be built, or had been built. And by then, because we had these other pipeline schemes coming up, we wanted to focus on those and move on. And by then people had moved on to the A11 in Norfolk, around the Windham bypass, to the M11 in outer London, where there were over 600 homes were destroyed and forcibly evicted. Families were forcibly evicted from their homes to make way for that road. So I think that was the thing, was that it was a sort of two-way shift, if you like. It was impossible to carry on at Twyford because of the law, and there were other things that needed to happen.
Jamie, you've got your hand up on one screen and you're there on another one.
Yeah.
I was cooking dinner at the same time, so that's why my camera's off.
I didn't know you could do astral projection, Jamie.
Miraculous, always in two places at once.
Yeah, I was really interested about the Conservative councillor getting involved right from the start, and I was wondering what his sort of motivations was, and clearly that's quite a different position to our local Conservative councillors in the Wensum Valley road. And what was it that was motivating him, do you think? And what was the sort of, did you get other support from other local councillors? You mentioned that the EU politician. Was there other support from local politicians?
Yeah, and across the political spectrum. I mean, one of the things that was remarkable was, you end up with a situation where you've got former peace women from Greenham Common standing beside a Conservative councillor and a bunch of New Age travellers and some anarchists, and all sitting on the same bulldozer, because, like I said, it was a remarkable place and it made remarkable things happen. I think for David and for quite a few of the other locals, it was just, I mean, Conservatives very often have a deep care for the countryside. I mean, it's inherent, really, and that is often very much the case. And I think for David, he just lived close by and he'd walked and enjoyed the place for a long time, and it was very important to him. So and I mean, it is something that I hope with the Western Link, as and when we're all allowed outdoors again, I hope we can do some walks and people can experience that landscape, because it is so remarkable in just the same way. It's absolutely fabulous out there.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But I think some of the Labour councillors and obviously some of the Green councillors have walked out there. I don't know if any of the Conservative councillors haven't.
And we did get a sitting Conservative MP ousted in the 1992 general election and replaced with a guy called John Denham, who was a Labour Party politician who stood on a "Don't Build the Road Through Twyford Down" ticket, and he was a fabulous ally in Parliament. He really was. I write about that a bit, how much he spoke up for what we were doing in the House of Commons.
Thank you. We've got Rachel's got a hand up on the screen. Are you there? Yes.
Thanks. Thank you, Andrew. Sorry, I would make myself visible, but I think my computer will completely implode if I do that. I'm having great trouble with it. Thanks, Helen. Fantastic to hear your story firsthand. I didn't really know much about Twyford, to be honest. I spent a fair bit of time on the HS2 line in the Chilterns last year in between lockdowns at different camps. And I live streamed the felling of Coronation Wood on the Sizewell belts a couple of months back. And I think that's not a boast in any way. I'm just trying to get to the point, which is Natural England. This has been a real learning curve for me. I used to think that Natural England sort of did more or less what they said on the tin, but I'm of the opinion that they don't and they don't care particularly. And even if they do care, they haven't got any teeth. It's still down to the law enforcement, wildlife crime police units, who are small, under-resourced, as we no doubt know. And I've stood there and chatted to one of these specialist policemen, and it just wasn't going to do anything, wasn't really that bothered at Coronation Wood. It came down anyway, despite a lack of bat licenses. Same in HS2 Woods, no bat licenses. Not just about bats, as we know, but that's one thing we can have them on in theory because they're this protected species. And it does make you despair. You feel so helpless, and it was very depressing. And somebody said something in the chat about maybe our tactics are going to have to change, we're going to have to toughen up, and I think there is an element of that, but I also think it's about numbers, and I really, really strongly feel that, and I cannot personally see any other way other than direct but non-violent on our account action, as we've seen with XR, etc. But it has to be in numbers, and obviously during COVID lockdown that's impossible, and it's been to HS2's advantage, not just them. But I hope when we come out of that, maybe, you know, things will get better for protesters and protest. But really, the COVID should have meant that they stopped doing the work. The contractors stopped, but of course we know they've escalated it, if anything, and taken full advantage of that situation. So it's very, very difficult. The other thing I would say is, from what I've seen, and I know lots of you will have seen live streams from HS2 as well, that the violence, maybe it's decreased, but sometimes it seems just as bad as what you, if not, maybe not quite so bad as at Twyford, but not far off, because they're now sort of springing camps and protesters at night, so that they're less visible to the public and anybody else. It's more difficult to see what's going on, especially with the torch shining in their faces. But it's still pretty brutal. So I just wanted to say that, really. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rachel. I think I agree with every word you say. And yeah, I mean, it can feel hugely despairing. It really can. But I do think it's that warmth of community that the women that I read out were talking about is very important. And recognizing that it's tough, and looking after each other and looking after yourself is very important too. I haven't stopped in the 30 years since then. I've done other things. I actually live in a house these days, which is quite remarkable. You know, I haven't moved house for a long time, and that's quite remarkable. It's a good way of looking after yourself. But you know, the other people around you are a big thing in keeping going. And I do think it's, as I said, it's those noisy defeats and quiet victories that you have to remember. It's very, very important to do that. That it feels to me like what's happening now is very much the same as happened in the late 80s and early 90s, that you have a very omnipotent government who think they can do just about whatever they want and line the pockets of their mates through doing it. And that's not a party political point, it's just who they are. And I also feel they're very wedded to this outdated notion of building huge infrastructure projects because they believe that's the only way to stimulate the economy. And I think we have to challenge that massively. And at the same time, back then, Natural England was known as English Nature. They just swapped the words around and made them a new logo sometime in the 90s. And exactly the same, you know, they were not allowed to speak at public inquiries in the late 80s and early 90s. They were not allowed to speak at the public inquiry against the Newbury bypass. And, you know, their teeth were not just, you know, covered up, they were completely removed. So, you know, I mean, I have friends that work for Natural England, and I feel for them because, you know, they're good people, they're good individuals, but they work for an organisation that, you know, it all barely exists anymore. It really does. And how we get those people to back us, I think, would be a good question. You know, how do we get those people to stop feeling so disempowered and be able to speak up and say, you know, enough. We've crowded the biodiversity of this island into small enough spaces. We've filled the air and the rivers with enough crap. Enough. I think Richard's got his hand up, unless there was anyone else first.
Well, yeah, we had Liz and Robert. Liz, do you want to come in, or shall I read your question out?
Read it out.
I'll read it out. How do we convince local people that their own environment will be trashed? And then often they're not very impressed by hippie activists. So that, I mean, that's certainly something we know in the Wensum Valley, I think. It's been quite difficult to get the locals on board.
Yeah, and there aren't a lot of locals there, really, are there? Because it's the land is largely owned by big estates. So other than a couple of quite small villages, and people buy into the idea, don't they, that this road is going to somehow make their lives better. You know, just nuts, but there you go. How do we convince local people? I don't know. I think we have to try every means that we can think of and see what works. And I think creative means are good, you know, and I know people are talking about art projects and things along the route, and I think that would be really good. Engaging people in something that's positive and constructive is good. People are not very impressed by hippie activists. No, I don't know. I've never been a hippie, so I wouldn't know. But no, it's, you know, that there are people have prejudices, don't they? I always like the saying, you know, a crank is a small thing that starts a revolution. So, you know.
And then we've got a question from Robert there. I'll ask you. Nice.
Have we lost him? Oh, there he is.
Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Oh, he's muted.
I'm asking him to unmute. Can you,
Hi.
Start again, yeah.
Okay, you can hear me. Yeah, I just wanted to say hello. I missed the first part of everything. I just wanted to say hello. I was on the Newbury bypass protests and Nome 11 Link Road protests, and I'm still here. And I just wanted to I now mainly do stuff to do with road danger reduction and cycling and urban stuff. And we've had the decision, or we've had the mention of what Grant Shapps did due to the very excellent Transport Action Network. So, you know, a lot of us still here, still plugging away. You know, one of the activists, a pal of mine called Patrick Field, said to struggle is to win. And actually that's not, you know, in one sense that's not true, because, you know, we want to stop the road building program and that's it. And now everything is a lot more urgent because of climate change. But, you know, do get stuck in and do stuff. I mean, I was never one of the ones who were really, you know, risking imprisonment and so on, but I was there and I try to help out, and there's always ways you can help out, and do crack on and do stuff, and you will find there are lots of people around who can help and are of assistance, and it's terribly important to build the links between, you know, the local cyclists and the local people, ramblers and people like that, and people who are just sort of, you know, maybe not so interested in getting a buzz from the natural world, but who just say, look, you know, we have to do this. Climate change means we can't have any more roads, so let's just do what we can, and that's it. And the opposite of hope isn't despair, it's grief or something else. And, you know, I think in the case of a lot of the campaigns I was involved in, I never really kind of thought, yeah, you know, we're just going to win, it's just going to stop. I just carried on, and it was good to get the comradeship. And some of the people I was involved with in the 90s are people who are now involved in various campaigns, could be for parklets in streets, overall road danger reduction, doing stuff on promoting cycle networks, etc., etc. And you know, just crack on, and if you're doing it, you're doing the right thing.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. There was so much in there for people to take away. And you're absolutely right. You know, there's always so many things that need doing. I mean, Hannah Lena, who's here on the list today, you know, has been working so hard to get more of these webinars set up. And Liz, who's also here today, you know, is taking volunteers out doing extra ecological surveys as volunteers. All of those things are so important. You know, it's not that one thing is more important than the other, and I think that's very necessary to keep saying that. I'd also wanted to, you were talking about hope, and if anybody does feel that they ever suffer from despair, I don't know if you can see this, it's probably turned the wrong way around because of the screen. There's a fantastic book by Rebecca Solnit, I'll put it in the chat, called Hope in the Dark, and I recommend that anyone involved in campaigning reads it. And somebody gave it to me, and I had it for my shelf for 2 years, and I kept looking at it thinking, I'm not bloody going to read that because there's no bloody hope. I was not in a good place. And then I sat down and I read it all in one sitting and it's so incredible. And she has this wonderful phrase in it where she says, hope isn't a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa and clutch. It's an axe that you use to smash down the door. And I just think that's absolutely fantastic. It really is, because, you know, once you think there has to be some hope, then you can go and do something, and you can't live without it. But, you know, I mean, you'll remember Newbury, Robert. It was, I mean, the Newbury bypass campaign was so different from Twyford. There were so few of us at Twyford, and there were so many of us at Newbury. And it was a 9-mile long route, and we fought every tree on that route. It's through a winter when it was -13. So, you know, this winter, you know, a couple of weeks ago when it was really cold, there were lots of things in the news saying this is the coldest winter since January 96. And I'm like, yeah, I remember where I was January 1996.
Yeah.
And
can I just
and I'll just finish. The thing that I remember was, you know, before dawn we would get into the trees, and there'd be no tree houses. You just get into the trees before dawn, before the security guards and the chainsaw men came in. Women from the town would come out before work with flasks of coffee and cake, and we'd all have bits of string in our pocket, and we'd dangle them out of the trees, and we'd pull up these flasks of coffee, and we'd have a hot breakfast, you know. And the small things meant so much. Sorry, Robert, go on.
No, that's fine. I mean, one of the things from that is you get a lot of stories. So I remember I actually camped at Newbury over Christmas, and I had done a bit of training in camping when I was in the cadet force at school, and there was a guy there, and I was sort of started to give him a bit of advice on camping out when it's very cold. And he kind of looked at me for a bit and he said, yeah, I did my Arctic training when I was in the RAF in the Himalayas. So he actually knew a lot more about it than me. And it's kind of funny, but there are lots of these nice little stories that you remember. And, you know, you can always do stuff like you can bring food, I was going to say, and people brought books and things like that. So it's lots of that stuff you can remember. Actually, talking about Zoom, of course, we didn't have Zoom in those days. And I remember some of the people at Nome 11 Link Road, there was one guy who was very into computers, and he had this kind of big computer up, and we were all a bit suspicious of it. And he said, oh, this is going to be terribly important, you know. So it's, you just kind of remember those sorts of things. And that's good, you know, you can tell people about it.
It looks like there's quite a few questions coming in, Andrew. Are you able to keep track of them?
Well,
I've lost where I am.
I'm not sure if Rachel's got another question, then Jamie, I think.
No, thanks. I've just been commenting, sorry.
Okay, I'll lower your hand then. Just discovered I can do. Jamie, you've got a question there, and you want to ask that one.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I've only skimmed bits of your book, Helen. I haven't actually read the whole thing yet, but I will do. But the bits that I've read are beautifully written. There's a lot of it's really nice writing in there. And I was wondering what you thought you know, what you hope people get from the book, and what role you think arts and writing can play in this.
Yeah.
You mentioned Rebecca Solnit, and again,
Yeah.
example of fine writing, I guess.
So, I mean, to start with, really, I did just want to write this history that had never been written. But as I went along, I began to feel more and more, as I said at the beginning, really, I want this to have a life and to be useful and be a way that, you know, if people can read it, they can take away inspiration. And quite a few people have read it and got back to me and said, that was just so inspiring. I feel like I need to go and do something now. And that's great. What I think the arts can do is to perhaps show people that it isn't all about the direct action, but that there's other ways of understanding the world around us and ways of engaging with it that are meaningful. And it's good for things like awareness raising and bringing people in and giving people a way to talk. I mean, when Robert was talking about Newbury, one of the most powerful events I remember happening at the Newbury bypass was a multi-faith ceremony on the route, when people from all faiths came and took part in this sort of afternoon, and it was so powerful. And I think sometimes these different ways of looking at the world, whether you know it's through art or writing or religion, faith, whatever, it just tells a story in a different way and helps people have a different way into something and brings different people in. And I think, you know, it's been so hard this last year, hasn't it? Because I would love to have seen a sculpture trail along part of the Western Link Road. I would love to have seen us out there round a fire one evening reading poetry to each other and singing songs and telling stories. And, you know, those are events that people will come to that may not come to a protest. They may not come and hold a placard. But if you say, you know, there's going to be fairy lights in the trees and there's going to be stories for children around the fire, they might come. And so many things we could do like that would just be really lovely. Does that help?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, just something to look forward to for post-pandemic, I think.
Oh, thank goodness, yes, let's.
Sculpture trail. That sounds really.
We'll have stopped this road by then, though. We'll have to find something else to do.
Can we have a big party when HS2 and the roads and Sizewell and everything else gets cancelled? Can we just have like a party to end all parties, please?
Is there anybody I've missed who wants to ask a question?
Oh, yes, somebody says about getting the book in libraries. Yes, that's one thing on my to-do list, is to get it out to libraries. Libraries are libraries shut at the minute? Does anyone know? I've lost track. But once libraries are open, you can go in and request that they order a book. Mm-hmm. And if a couple of people go and do it, then they will. So you can do that. You can go in and request that they stock it.
Ours is sort of semi-shut. If it helps it, you can you can order stuff online and you can go and collect it. They'll let you go and get it, but I don't think they're not letting you into the most of it. Do you know what I mean? There's like a desk at the front, and then you can't get any further.
And somebody's recommended Braiding Sweetgrass. Yes, that's one of the best books ever written, in my view. It's fantastic. Yeah. Jamie, you've mentioned about the Book Hive. I have emailed them and I haven't heard from them, so I'm assuming they're a bit overwhelmed at the minute. So I'll get back in touch with them again.
Maybe if we all write into them and ask them to stock
it. If you ask them to order it and stock it, they will. Yeah. Often it's better to come from readers. Yeah. So I was going to ask either Andrew or Hannah Lena what is coming up next on the webinar series and in terms of the campaign. I think it'd be nice to finish with that.
Hannah Lena, do you want to talk about that? And I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, so we've got a talk next Friday, and that's at 7 o'clock instead of 7:30, about the Wensum and Chalk River and the importance and vast sort of biodiversity and of chalk rivers. It's probably about the same length as this, and Jonah, I can't remember his surname, from
Tosney.
Tosney, yeah, from Norfolk Rivers Trust. He's going to do the presentation, and then there'll be open sort of discussion like we've had tonight after that. So that's one thing. And there are other things in the pipeline, but it's all on our Facebook page under events. Best to go there, I think, rather than say lots of dates.
Yeah.
And then, but one thing that I myself, in terms of what's coming up, has found really useful is actually to sign up for the Stop the Wensum Link newsletter. So if you go to the web page, www.stop the Wensum Link, you can leave your email address, and then you get an emailed newsletter with all dates and activities and lots of good stuff in, which is really good way of linking up, I think. Than remembering going on the Facebook page.
And am I right in thinking there's a meeting coming up to discuss what artists can do? Artists,
yeah, on the 8th of March. But again, the link, I don't know if you've got that there, Andrew, but it's on the Facebook page.
I haven't got the link to that actually.
No,
I
but
can't.
it's on there under upcoming events.
Right, that's March the 8th, is it?
Yeah.
Right, okay. That's the same day as the council.
Yeah.
Are making their decision.
Yeah,
so.
it is. It is.
Yeah.
The same. But and it's for artists, but it's also for people who are just interested in that approach. I think it's a very broad invitation, so you don't have to be sort of have had an exhibition at the Tate for joining or something.
Maybe what we'd do is get the link to that and any other links.
There it is.
Oh, I'm glad you've put Stop the Wensum link in, Helen. I was trying to look for that one.
It's a little bit out. It needs an update because we've had somebody who's done that, he's just had to stop doing that for a while. So it's a little bit dated, the web page.
Right.
But the main events are on there.
Yeah.
It will be updated.
Right. But that particularly that March the 8th one, that sounds really, really good.
Yeah.
We'll get the Facebook.
I mean, I did an Arts Council funded project with a photographer around fracking, and we did interviews with people involved in fracking campaigns in the north of England, and he was taking photographs of landscapes that were threatened by fracking. And one of the things we did was put some of that into a very, very cheaply produced pamphlet that then just got put through people's doors. And we felt it was nice to have something that was talking about the campaigns and what needed to be done. I mean, I just gave them an essay and they used it. That wasn't a kind of, big brash headlines and stop this, don't do that. It was just talking about the impacts in other people's words and talking about the places and, places that people were playing that were going to be used for fracking drills and things. So, there's so many different things you can do that's really, really positive.
Well, that's probably a good moment to finish on things people can do which are positive. Just to thank you very, very much, Helen. A really, really inspiring talk, and it's so interesting to hear back about those times in the early 90s. I actually remember the Salisbury Hill stuff in Bath, actually, because I used to live there around the same time, I think. So it's really sort of brought back some of my memories. I really couldn't go anywhere near Twyford Down.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody, for all the wide discussion we've had. That was lots of, so many inspiring questions and energy to take us forward, really. Do keep following the Stop the Wensum Link campaign and, of course, all the other road campaigns across the country. We're about to sort of, probably step up to another phase, because the council unfortunately are, look like they're going ahead. And I'm not really sort of sure quite what the landscape's going to be after that. In terms of campaigning landscape after March, but once they've made their bid to the government, we're just going to have to see what we can do. But do all keep in touch, and this campaign I think is going to grow and grow, and hopefully quite soon we'll better go and have those parties in the wood and sculpture trails and so on. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure, and thank you all for coming. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to the one next week. That'll be great.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah.
We'll
really
have to think of some more subjects until we're all allowed out again.
Yeah. Yeah, I sort of happened to, after I heard about Jonah Tosney was going to be running that, I read an article about him reintroducing burbot fish down in West Norfolk, which is really interesting. So a fish which hasn't been around for about 50 years.
I know. It's it would be great to see those rivers being as they should be again, and hard to imagine how that can be if you're going to put a viaduct over it, know, and damage the floodplain. That I'm just going to message someone who's messaging me.
All right, there's still a few messages.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of friends here.
Right, excellent.
Yeah. So it would be nice to hear him speak. Yeah, thanks for that. I think we can pack up, can't we?
Yeah, well, yeah, if you've done your messages, have you?
Yes, I think that's everything now.
Great.
Yeah, so no, that was really good. And is the I know you don't come to these meetings, which is fine because you have enough on your plate, but those Stop the Wensum Link meetings are going really well.
Great.
Yeah,
that's really good to hear.
It's nice that they're bringing in new people and giving people actions to do. Yeah, it's nice to see. So yeah. Oh, it's nice. I got a nice message from someone there. Right, I'm going to go, I think. That was absolutely great. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, cheerio, Helen. Cheerio, everybody.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.